This happened in the early summer of 2020, right when COVID was at its peak. I'm sure most of you can relate to staying at home during quarantine and not being able to go out. With the constant boredom of staying locked away inside of my house, I decided to take a day for a fishing trip. My name is Edgar. I'm 17 years old now, but the events that I'm about to tell you happened about 5 years ago. It started with me and my grandfather Richard. We were going fishing just like we had many times before in our little boat in the middle of the lake. I loved those moments with my grandfather. It was relaxing, and he would tell me stories all day long. One day, it all changed, however, a day I wish never happened. Still, after 5 years, I'm not forgetting any details. It still burned deep into my mind. It started out normal enough. We gathered our fishing gear, got it in the back of our truck, and hopped in. We headed out for the lake, and the drive went by smoothly. After we got there, we transferred all our gear from the truck into the boat and got in ourselves, letting the water carry the boat as we made our way a bit deeper. It was beautiful out in the water, surrounded by nature, our boat gently rocking left and right. It was a great lifestyle, and we both loved it. As we were casting our fishing rods, my grandpa telling me one of his stories, I noticed something glinting a bit in front of our boat. I pointed it out to my grandfather, who decided to try and fish it out. Maybe it was a necklace or something, and we thought that it would be cool if we found something like that in the water. As my grandfather cast his line and started to roll it back, I could see he didn't catch the shiny object. He did catch something, though. I could see it even under the water. As he pulled the object out, we could both see that it was a bone. Weird, we thought, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was small enough to be a fish bone or something, so we just cast a line again. This time, however, the line seemed to struggle with the weight, but we could see the shiny object coming up. As he was bringing it out, I could see the object was attached to something bigger, but in the water, I thought it could just be some random trash laying around. As he got it out of the water, however, it all changed. What we saw in front of us was, without a doubt, a human skull, and there was a pendant attached around one of its eye sockets. My grandfather quickly tossed the fishing rod from his hands, and he wanted to go home immediately. We didn't bring cell phones, so we had to get back home to call the police. We made it back, and in a rush, we jumped into the truck as he sped off. It was slowly starting to get dark as we made our way home, the forest surrounding us. I thought I could see a shadowy figure running along our side in the forest on multiple occasions. I didn't bring it up to my grandpa, however, because it looked like it was a humanoid but running on 4 legs, and I was sure humans can't run that fast, so I just thought it was my imagination because I was scared. When we got home, my grandpa called the police and told them where the lake was and that there was a fishing pole there too. Some officers came to our house to get a report, and we explained how we came across it. They thanked us for our time and were on their way as me and my grandfather watched behind. That night, I had trouble sleeping, waking up multiple times to see a shadowy figure in the corner of my room, just for it to be gone after I blinked again. I woke up the next morning feeling tired, like I had just run a marathon instead of sleeping. I went downstairs, and my mom had already cooked me some waffles for breakfast, which made the morning a bit more bearable. I loved waffles. I finished up eating and headed outside to play with my friends, but I could never shake the feeling of being watched. When I brought it up to my friends, they would say that they felt normal and that I'm just paranoid. I believed them. I hadn't seen anything, after all, and I was ruining fun for myself and them because of my paranoia. It still didn't help. In fact, every day that went by, the feeling became stronger and more frequent. It had gotten to the point where I didn't want to leave the house at all, because I was feeling unsafe. When my grandfather saw me acting strange, he asked me what was wrong. "I don't know, Grandpa. I saw something moving parallel to our car when we were coming back from that lake," I said, expecting him to comfort me and say how everything is going to be fine. What I saw instead was a pure look of terror and panic on my grandfather's face as he got up and frantically paced around the room. They followed us. I should have known they'd follow us. They never found that damned skull. It was a trap all along, he said as I saw a couple of tears forming in his eyes. Why the hell did you tell me this now, huh? Why didn't you tell me earlier? He yelled as I started to cry, thinking I had done something terrible. I'm sorry, Grandpa. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me because I was scared. I couldn't. I trailed off as tears coated my cheeks and dripped from my face. My grandpa didn't even look at me as he headed for the stairs. We're doomed, I could hear him mumble as he made his way up. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I felt guilty. I didn't know why my grandfather was so upset. Sure, I could sometimes see a figure in the shadows or feel something watching me, but it never affected me otherwise. When it was about 4 a.m. and I could finally feel my eyes getting heavy, I could hear some sort of chanting sound mixed with buzzing. Right after that, I heard a loud crash in the hallway. I didn't know what it was, but I was too scared to look. I stayed in my bed until I heard my mom scream loudly. I jumped out of bed, not caring about the fear anymore, thinking something bad had happened to my mother. As I rushed out to the hallway, I saw my mother crying over my grandpa, who was lying on the floor. When I got closer, I saw the reason she was crying. My grandpa looked like he had drowned, blue color enveloping his skin, his clothes wet. I couldn't hold my vomit in any longer. I puked all over the floor, feeling nauseous and lightheaded as I passed out. I woke up in my room, my mother sitting next to me on a chair. She hugged me after I woke up and cried on my shoulder. I asked her if Grandpa was dead, and she just nodded her head. His lungs were full of water. No one knows how it happened or how he got to the hallway in that condition. It was all a mystery. My mother did, however, report that she heard whispered chants along with buzzing. After I told her I heard the same thing, she was shocked, thinking it was all in her head from the lack of sleep she'd been getting recently. We both went to bed that night, my eyes growing heavy as soon as I lay down on the bed. I dozed off almost immediately from exhaustion, but I was awoken by the sound of whispered chanting and buzzing coming from the hallway. Thinking it was whatever had killed my grandfather, I stayed in my room, silent as the night outside my house. That was until about 20 minutes later, I once again heard my mother scream and then gurgle like she was drowning. I jumped out of bed again, but as soon as I reached for the door, the sound stopped. As I opened it, I could see my mother in the same state my grandfather was the night before, blue skin, wet clothes. I started crying uncontrollably for hours until I finally found myself going to the phone and dialing 911. An ambulance and police officers came. I don't remember any of it. The funeral, those couple of days went by in a blur. I found myself in a foster home right up until last month. They let me come back to my property because I was turning 18 soon. As I'm recording this, there is a sound in front of my door. It sounds like whisper chanting and buzzing. I think they are waiting until 12 a.m. when I turn 18. This is probably my last day here, and I wanted to post this as a warning to everyone. If there is a shiny object in the water while you're fishing, turn around and go home. It's not worth it. I live in South Florida, a place where it's notorious to go fishing. My state was still on lockdown, but I didn't care. I drove about an hour's drive away to Key West and went under a bridge to where I was sure I would get a decent catch. The waves were a little rough, but it didn't matter. Fast forward to about 30 minutes later, I'm still fishing, waiting for a bite. I look to my left and see what appeared to be a blue tarp setup behind one of the pillars of the bridge. I thought nothing of it, but for whatever reason, I looked back and saw a man standing there looking at me. To be honest, he kind of startled me as I jumped a little bit and nodded my head as a hello. However, he didn't seem to acknowledge my greeting as he kept staring at me with this blank expression I couldn't even describe. By the looks of it, he looked homeless, worn, torn clothes and had a full-on white beard, kind of like what you would picture as your typical old fisherman. What made me unsettled, however, was that his right hand was always behind his back. I pretended to concentrate on fishing, but I could still feel his gaze looking at me. Suddenly, he then jumps into the water and is swimming directly toward me. Even with the rough waves and the current from under the bridge, he was extremely fast. I was out from under that bridge in less than 15 seconds and got in my car with my foot glued to the gas pedal. I also left my stuff behind as, obviously, my life was more worth saving than that. I drove about a few miles where I stopped at a gas station for a snack and then proceeded to go home. What that man was going to do to me or what he wanted, I don't know. I assumed he was probably a dangerous homeless person who didn't like people near where he lived. The next day, I drove back to the bridge and tried to get my stuff, only to find it gone. Not only that, but the blue tarp and the man were also gone. Nothing was left except for an old hunting knife left on one of the platforms where the pillars were held up. After seeing it, I knew that's probably what he was hiding behind his back. Ever since I was a little kid, all the older men in my family would take me fishing every opportunity they got. It was like some family ritual. I, being the youngest, meant that I was next in line to become an expert like all of them claimed to be. The ones who took it the most seriously were my dad and his brother Eugene. Our houses were decked out like the ones you've probably seen on fishing shows. I won't go into detail, but if you took a step into my house, you'd instantly be able to tell my parents spend more time on the water than on the land. This is actually his story, not mine. My dad's a pretty hard guy to scare, but let me tell you, whenever he tells the story, it's like he's a different person. He doesn't like talking about it, but every so often at a family gathering or a special occasion, one of my relatives will ask him to tell it, and he will. My dad's name is Gwyn. He was fishing with my uncle Eugene and their close friends Clytus, Dylan, and Lagan. They had set out early before the sun had even broken the horizon, heading to a remote spot they had all agreed was prime fishing territory. This place was a couple of hours boat ride from the nearest marina, tucked away in a secluded cove-type area that few bothered to explore. It was known among them for its abundant bass and the occasional pike. The day started like any other fishing trip, with the boat cutting smoothly through the mist rising off the water, everyone sharing stories and jokes over the hum of the engine. They anchored the boat in a familiar cove surrounded by dense forest. Lagan was the first to crack open a beer, even though it was so early in the morning. My dad tells me all the time that Lagan is his wild friend, the one who tends to drink a little more than he should. They fished for hours, the only sounds being the occasional splash of a lure hitting the water and their own laughter, and the occasional crunch of empty beer cans that they were drinking like water. As the day wore on, they had their fair share of catches, each one sparking a small celebration. As dusk approached, the light began to wane. A dense fog rolled in from the water. My dad describes it as the boat literally being swallowed by fog. Clytus, who was the most experienced fisherman of the group, kept saying that he had never seen fog so thick. That's how unnatural it was. Dylan, the jester of the group, was almost as drunk as Lagan, both of whom were seemingly unfazed by the fog that had ensnared them. It was starting to get dark. They had originally thought that they could just wait out the fog, but it didn't seem to be going anywhere. My dad and Clytus agreed that Eugene should just try to drive the boat out of the cove and into the open ocean, where the fog probably wouldn't be as dense. Eugene agreed, but even though he was typically the most cautious, he only narrowly avoided colliding with the shore. He refused to risk further damage to his prized boat. They reluctantly came to terms with the fact that they'd probably have to spend the night on the boat. My dad made the point that they'd need to tell their families about the situation, and of course, they had drifted into an area of the cove that had no signal. My dad needed to handle some business at work, so neglecting the problem was not an option. He offered to go ashore in search of a signal, and Clytus and Dylan said they'd join him. Eugene would stay back to guard the boat and an increasingly inebriated Lagan. My dad, Dylan and Clytus made their way over to the shore and jumped out of the boat, only getting slightly wet. My dad made a point of snagging the emergency flares in the boat, just in case they got lost and needed to signal Eugene to come find them. The three of them made their way into the pitch-black woods, lit only by the shine of their phone flashlights. My dad and his friends have all done their fair share of camping, so it wasn't like a forest scared them too much. They began trekking uphill, hoping that higher ground would give them a better chance of finding a signal. My dad always made a point of emphasizing how dark yet eerily foggy the forest was. You could practically feel yourself slicing through the fog just as they were adjusting to the dense atmosphere. A series of strange clicking noises began to permeate the silence, first emerging from directly in front of them before encircling them completely. These sounds were unlike any forest sounds they were familiar with. It was rhythmic yet erratic, as if someone was tapping out a code meant only for the woods themselves. The distinctiveness of the noise made one thing clear: it was human-made. The realization that they weren't alone hit them like a freight train. Clytus, the most seasoned of the trio when it came to outdoor survival, whispered urgently for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed, with a note of genuine concern in his voice. As the lights switched off, the darkness became thicker than the fog. The clicking noises stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that seemed to weigh on their chests. Time lost meaning as they stood there, frozen, unsure of their next move. I'm sure they were all thinking the same thing. The idea that they might have stumbled upon some kind of clandestine gathering or a woods cult was terrifying. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the silence was broken by rustling noises, this time much closer. Then silence again. And then a guttural scream echoed through the trees, a sound so primal and full of anguish that it rooted them to the spot. Before they could process what was happening, rapid stomping noises thundered through the woods towards them. The three men took off back the way they had come, acting on fear and pure instinct. My dad fired the flare gun behind them. The flare cut through the fog, lighting the woods up for a moment. The woods were as clear as day, and the sight that met their eyes was nothing short of horrifying. Illuminated by the flare's red glow was a pack of more than 10 individuals dressed in what could only be described as tribal attire. Some of them brandished wooden spears, but the light from the flare only lasted a split second. Dylan screamed and almost stumbled, but Clytus quickly grabbed his arm to keep him upright. My dad describes this part as the most overwhelming feeling of pure terror he has ever experienced. The forest seemed to fight against them as they fled, ducking under branches and jumping over roots. By some miracle, they emerged from the tree line, panting and disoriented but alive. They screamed at Eugene to start the engine, the urgency in their voices leaving no room for question. Eugene complied immediately, and the boat lurched forward just as their pursuers reached the shoreline. In the chaos, my dad fired the last flare into the air back towards the shore. For a split second, as the flare's light pierced the fog, they saw their pursuers at the water's edge. It was freakish. There must have been at least 15 of them just standing motionless at the water's edge. The flare's light faded, and it was dark again. Eugene managed to get a safe distance away and stop the boat again. After the engine was off, the only sounds were Dylan, my dad, and Clytus's breathing. My dad says he wasn't able to process what had happened for nearly an hour. He was functioning off pure adrenaline and survival instincts. They ended up taking turns keeping watch while the others slept and left first thing in the morning as soon as the fog dissipated. That I've been fishing for as long as I can remember. I'm almost 60 years old now, and even though I've been fishing thousands of times, I can't think of any other way I'd rather spend the rest of my life. My kids are all off living their own lives, and things around the house are quiet now. You could hear a pin drop most of the time. Sometimes I miss the old days, being able to throw the pigskin around with my boys in the backyard, but some things just aren't in the game plan anymore. I usually fish with my pals from college, but more often than not, I find myself going at it alone, like a lone wolf. This was one of those times. I haven't stepped foot outside upstate New York in over 15 years. I don't see a reason to. We've got some of the best fishing lakes in the country, and I plan on making full use of them. It was mid-April, in the early season, just after the ice out and before May hit. For whatever reason, I decided I wanted a more secluded spot this time around, so I chose a nondescript lake in the middle of nowhere that was pretty small. I drove up an hour before sunrise so that I could be out on the water when the sun poked through. I unstrapped my kayak from the roof of the car and made my way over to the lake. I rode out to the middle of the lake and admired the beautiful early colors starting to paint the sky. It felt like home. You can bet your bottom dollar I'd never trade a day like this for anything. It was a little chilly, but I've got skin like steel. I could tell the sun was just about to appear in the sky, so I started gearing up. I was shooting for a largemouth bass, so I made my way back to the outside edge of the weed beds, planning to move back toward the middle of the lake if I got skunked. I went for a 6 and 1/2 foot medium action spinning rod with 9 pounds monofilament line. I was using a wacky rig, which is a 4-inch rubber stick worm, my go-to for catching largemouth. Just before I was about to start what would hopefully be a swell day on the water, I noticed something strange. Across the lake, I couldn't quite see what was going on, but I could tell that there was movement. At first, I thought it was a fellow fisherman, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached into my knapsack and pulled out my pair of binoculars I used for bird watching. I looked across the lake and saw 3 figures wearing dark colors and hoods covering their faces. They looked like they were digging a hole or something on the edge of the lake. I kept watching. They finished their hole, and while I was expecting them to put something inside it, they actually did the opposite. One of them pulled something out of the hole, which I couldn't make out even with my binoculars. Then the other 2 did the same, pulling out a few more things that I couldn't quite see. I was beyond confused. Then I watched as they started tossing the items into the lake, each one making a distinct splash as it smacked the water. Something was wrong. Out of nowhere, a wave of fear washed over me. I didn't know who these people were, but I started thinking they might be dangerous. I didn't know what to do. Thankfully, they started to leave without noticing me. I thought about turning a blind eye but couldn't bring myself to do it. I waited until they disappeared into the woods and slowly rode my way over. I was shaking at this point. I got to the spot where I was pretty sure they had tossed everything. I started fishing, only this time I wasn't fishing for fish, I was going for something else entirely. I fished around for about an hour with no luck. I had to try something different. I racked my brain, trying to figure out what I could do, and just then I remembered my depth checker. I had it tucked away in my Volvo. I was determined at this point. I rode back to shore, returned to my car, retrieved the depth checker, and rode back to the spot. I was sweating heavily at this point. I poked around for a bit, feeling nothing but the squishy lake bottom, and then I felt something hard, something metal. I made a mental note of the spot and grabbed my rod. I took the rig off and replaced it with the largest hook I had. I let the spool out slowly, my pointer finger feeling the gentle movement of the line. 50 years of fishing experience was going into this one catch. I felt the slight resistance in the line, it had hit something. I moved the line around slowly, hoping I'd be able to snag it on whatever was down there. After about a minute, the line tugged a little harder than was normal. I was snagged. I reeled in slowly, careful not to drop my catch. What I pulled out of the water had me shivering in my boots. I stared at the black 9mm on the end of my line. Those thugs had thrown a gun into the lake. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't even bother looking around for the other items. I reeled the gun into my kayak, careful not to touch it, and hightailed it out of there. As soon as I got to dry land, I called the police. They launched a full investigation and recovered several more unsettling things from the lake. I insisted on watching them conduct their search because I needed to know what was at the bottom of that lake. They found a keychain with about 7 keys on it and a bunch of old foreign coins from different countries wrapped in a cloth. The most eerie thing they found though, was a locket. It was waterlogged, so the pictures inside were faded and unintelligible. The police told me they'd contact me if they ever connected these dots to some kind of crime. They never called me, though. But the story didn't end there. One night, I don't remember how many days after this incident, I heard someone in my front yard say, "That was the car, I know it," and then people snooping around my yard. They never rang the bell or knocked on the door, but I heard multiple people circling my house, and then they just left. I have no idea if they were the same people, and if they were, I have no idea if I'm being watched any time I leave my house. I alerted the police once more, hoping this would reopen the investigation, but nothing became of it once again. I still have so many questions. Why would those items be buried in the first place, and why would those people go back just to dig them up and hide them again? Maybe they realized that there was a greater chance they'd be found in the ground, so they went back and threw them in the lake. Or maybe those items had been in that hole for years, and they decided to dig them up for some reason. All in all, this was the strangest thing that has ever happened to me while fishing. In the heart of the dense forest stood a lake, its waters dark and foreboding, shrouded in mystery and fear. Local legends whispered of a curse upon the lake, warning fishermen and adventurers alike to stay far away. But curiosity, as it often does, beckoned the bold to its shores. Among those drawn to the lake was Andrew, a seasoned angler with a thirst for adventure that overshadowed any superstition. Armed with his fishing gear and determination, he ventured into the woods, guided by stories of monstrous catches and whispered horrors. As he reached the edge of the lake, an eerie mist rose from its surface, obscuring what lay beneath. Ignoring the chill that crept up his spine, Andrew cast his line into the murky depths, eager to test his skills against whatever lurked below. Hours passed with little success, and the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. Just as Andrew prepared to call it a day, his line suddenly went taut, pulling him forward with unexpected force. With a grunt of surprise, he struggled to reel in his catch, the water churning and bubbling as whatever he had hooked fought against him. Heart pounding, Andrew finally managed to haul his prize onto the shore, only to stagger back in horror at what lay before him. It was no fish that writhed and thrashed at his feet, but a grotesque abomination straight from the nightmares of ancient lore. Its twisted form was a grotesque amalgamation of scales and tentacles, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence that sent shivers down Andrew's spine. In a panic, he stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet as he scrambled to escape the creature's grasp. But it was too late. The creature lunged forward with lightning speed, its tentacles wrapping around Andrew's legs and dragging him screaming into the depths below. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.